Hello from London. My name is Charles Hecker. I'm a partner at Control Risks, and I'm our global head of research in our political risk consultancy. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you today. RiskMap is our flagship annual forecast of political and security risk. We've been publishing RiskMap for more than 25 years, and it's the product of more than 100 of our political risk analysts and other colleagues from around the world. For the past several years, Control Risks has also been publishing a list of top 5 risks with every risk map. The top 5 is our view of the most important issues and trends for all of us to focus on, to plan for, and to adapt to in the coming year. Over the next few moments, we'll go through that list and have a look at the world to come. But before we go any further, let's have a brief introduction to the map itself. And first of all, please remember that this is not a snapshot of the world today, but is a forecast of the year to come. Now, the colors that you see on the map in front of you represent our forecast for security risk, from a very low dark green to an extreme deep red. The letters that you see in front of you are the forecast for political risk for the coming year, also from very low to extreme. So take a moment to find your favorite country. Take a moment to find where you're planning your next holiday when we get to do that again. But most importantly, have a look at the map and have a look at your company's footprint. The idea of the map is to help everyone understand that they have the right amount of bandwidth, the right people, and the right energy in the right places. And now, onto the top 5. Our number 1 risk for 2021, when we started thinking about RiskMap, a process that begins usually in September of the previous year, we wanted nothing more than to get back to the basic building blocks of political and security risk. Things like trade wars, regional conflicts, or political stability, all of the factors and drivers that we're accustomed to looking at. But we knew that this was going to be impossible. Just as sometimes COVID lingers in the human body to create a case of long COVID, the virus can also linger in the global body and will give geopolitics, we think, in 2021, a case of long COVID. There is no escaping the fact, really, that the pandemic will be the primary driver of risk in 2021. But the metrics will be different. Last year, we were following infection rates. This year, we're tracking vaccination rates. The way it looks so far is that the global exit from the pandemic will be slow and highly fragmented. I mean, look at it this way. In addition to the European Union, there are only, as of now, about 7 or 8 countries around the world that have booked enough vaccine to inoculate their entire populations. Most of the rest of the world, it's more than 90 countries, will be using the COVAX facility to acquire vaccine. But the COVAX program, in the best of all circumstances, promises only to vaccinate about 20% of the populations of the countries that are participating in the program. And even still, in the coming year, we believe there will be countries that do not get any vaccine at all. The result? The creation of have and have not countries and a multi-speed exit from the pandemic. Countries that have enough vaccine will be able to lift their restrictions and return to robust economic activity relatively quickly. Other countries will emerge from the pandemic much more slowly. And other countries perhaps won't leave pandemic conditions at all. They will create what we call permanent pockets of pandemic and the opportunity for the virus to further mutate. For companies, the challenge here is quite straightforward. All of us will have a global footprint in each of these types of countries. Countries that come out of the pandemic quickly, slowly, or not at all. This will require incredible agility, resilience, and flexibility. Which parts of our business are in which kinds of countries? Where will the pinch points be in 2021? And if we learned anything from our ability to cope with the beginning of the pandemic, how can we apply those lessons to the beginning of the end of the pandemic? Our number 2 risk for 2021 brings us to that other main global driver of risk for the coming year, and that's the relationship between the United States and China. This is probably a good time to remember, whether you're in the US or you're in China, or like a lot of us, you're somewhere else, that the United States-China rivalry is here to stay. This is not just a trade war. This is not just a maritime battle. This is a strategic rivalry for global technological supremacy. And those sorts of rivalries just don't go away. Instead, they stick around and they make headaches for anyone who wants to do business with the United States, with China, or like a lot of us, with both countries at the same time. This is probably also the time to remember that Washington, D.C. is uniformly anti-China. There is no such thing as a pro-China American politician. As a result, we anticipate broad policy continuity in Washington in the transition from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. We've just had one of the most dramatic presidential transitions in the history of the country. But we really don't think that policy towards China is going to change all that much. Hard to believe, but true. Here's what we think will really happen. Of course, some of the heat and some of the emotion has already come out of the relationship between the United States and China. You don't have to wake up in the morning anymore and check Twitter to understand how much trouble we're all in and what the latest development is in the relationship between Washington and Beijing. We will soon have a much clearer picture of US policy towards China because President Biden will turn to a much more robust and institutional-based machinery for the creation of US policy towards China. Companies will once again be able to plan and to anticipate the development of the relationship between the United States and China. Don't forget that President Biden knows China and knows Xi Jinping very well. China and Xi Jinping know President Biden very well. So hopefully few surprises or fewer surprises in the future. For the next 6 to 12 months, the United States and China will sort of be feeling each other out around the edges and trying to understand where they can cooperate, where they need to escalate, where they think the red lines lie, and where they may be able to get along. In those 6 to 12 months, use this opportunity to plan your company's strategy towards China. We don't need to lurch from crisis to crisis anymore. We can plan for the future. Bear in mind that the Biden administration will continue to push tariffs. It will continue to ban the export of certain types of sensitive technologies towards China. It will, of course, encourage the buy American or shop at home philosophy. But we don't think that the relationship will escalate in the toxic way that it had been under the Trump administration. Let's move on to our number 3 risk for the year, which talks about climate change and the environment. We didn't have climate change or the environment in our top 5 risks last year, and our clients were thinking that maybe we were living on a different planet. So we've put them back in for 2021. And here's what we're thinking. The number 1 risk in connection with climate change and the environment is misreading this unusual moment in the world and the unusual focus on climate change as a global priority. Countries and companies right now are practically tripping over each other and tripping over themselves to announce carbon neutral policies and green investment plans. And the United States, of course, has rejoined the Paris Accords on climate, which returns Washington to sort of moral authority and the bully pulpit on pushing for action on climate change. There has never before really been this focus globally on climate change and building back better and a green recovery. And here's what we think this means for companies. There will be very close linkage going forward between what companies do on climate and investment and regulatory policies around the world. For example, the United Kingdom will no longer finance carbon-based projects in the developing world. In the asset management community, we know that investment managers are going through their portfolios and looking at who they invest in and how much they invest based on whether those portfolio companies have, number one, done something to mitigate their impact on climate change, and also to make sure that those companies have some sort of plans in place to mitigate the impact of climate change on them. Listing agencies at stock markets around the world are doing the same thing. They want much more disclosure from the companies that they list on their impact on climate change and their contingency planning for the impact of climate change on them. Look out also, by the way, for the development of something called environmental due diligence as part of the way companies do business with each other before investing with each other, before signing contracts between each other. Companies want to know what each other's positions are on the environment. Finally, in activist circles, in the activist community, there really is no turning back. Activists are also focused on climate change in a way that we haven't seen in any of the number of years leading up to 2021. Once pandemic restrictions start to lift, we're going to see protests in the street, and we're going to see protests in the cyber arena. And we're going to see those protests aimed at companies that activists think are polluters, and also aimed at governments that aren't moving fast enough to change the regulatory climate on the environment. So a lot to think about there and a lot to consider. But this is probably not going away, not for 2021 and not for any of the years in the foreseeable future. Our number 4 risk for 2021 is in the cyber world, and cyber is pretty much always in our top 5 risks. What we're saying this year, though, is that risk going forward is primarily going to stem from what happens when companies take their 5-year technology strategy and they implement it in 5 weeks. That's what happened a lot in 2020. Companies needed to buy an awful lot of equipment, hardware and software, and they needed to buy it very quickly. And we're going to continue to have to buy hardware and software at an accelerated rate going forward. There is no slowing down in the transition from the physical world to the cyber world. And whether that is the way we buy and sell things, or whether that's just the way we work now, this rate of technology adoption is not slowing down. And this puts our companies at risk. Rushed procurement and rushed implementation is a major concern going forward. And in the article that we've written to go along with this risk as part of Risk Map, we cite a survey that says 76% of chief technology officers and chief information officers believe that their companies went too fast. They didn't update their risk registers. They didn't update their policies. They didn't update their usage procedures to keep track and keep pace with the implementation of new technology. And every time we leave a gap, and every time we make a mistake in the use or implementation of technology, there are cyber threat actors out there waiting to take advantage of our mistakes. Finally, just one other thing about cyber risk going forward, and that is that as we continue to buy technology, again, hardware and software, it's going to get harder to decide where to buy that technology and where to deploy that technology. That's in part because of the relationship between the United States and China, and also because of the emerging European independence in technology strategy. So be careful about where you buy your technology. Make sure that you do that with an eye towards where you can use it, where you can't use it, and also what to do with the data that technology creates. We're almost at the end, and it is our habit to leave you with a little bit of a philosophical question as our number 5 risk, and this year is no different. Our number 5 risk for 2021 sounds a little bit more like a question, and that is, what happens if your company is still so deep in crisis management that you miss the recovery? Most forecasters, including our partner company, Oxford Economics, most forecasters predict a strong economic rebound for the second half of 2021. Now, we know that there are potential downside risks to that forecast, but whether it starts sooner or whether it starts later, we know that there will be an economic recovery in 2021. Make sure you're ready when it starts, and that means actually now. In 2020, we saw some of the most severe risk that any of us have ever seen in our careers. And we think the same will by and large be true for 2021. At the beginning of the pandemic, almost exactly a year ago, Control Risks had the great privilege and the great opportunity to join our clients' crisis management teams and to sit in on those daily or weekly phone calls. And we learned an awful lot from those calls. We also hope, of course, that our clients learned a lot from our work on those calls. But what we understood is that companies that were able to focus their attention in 2 different directions at the same time were the companies that were able to survive the onset of the pandemic better than their competitors and better than other companies of equivalent size or business model. And that focus was on tactical issues and strategic issues, putting out the fires that the pandemic generated without forgetting about near-term and mid-term and even strategic opportunities. Now, sitting here now, it seems like a no-brainer. Of course, you're meant to think tactically, and of course, you're meant to think strategically at the same time. But in the middle of this crisis, on a daily basis, that was actually really difficult to do. And it's still not easy. But our reminder here in the number 5 risk is that as the pandemic begins to unwind, and as this fragmented, multi-speed recovery begins, make sure that all of the energy that you need is in ongoing crisis management, but all of the energy that you can is focused on the future and focused on the recovery.